you want to open up to Deuteronomy, we will be there tonight. And I told Tim that I intend to keep one eye on the window tonight, and if it looks like snowpocalypse starts to happen while we're here, then I can just make the most important points I have and wrap this up. I said, if I'm not paying attention to the window, to wave your arms and get my attention. And so I guess that applies for anybody now. But I will try to be mindful of that. We're doing our one lesson overviews. I didn't get this set up, and I can't do two things at once. So you got to be patient with me. We're doing our one lesson overviews, and we are to the book of Deuteronomy. This is probably as best a way I can think to get started, just to appreciate how important this book is in terms of New Testament quotes and quotes directly that come from Jesus. Jesus and the New Testament quote Psalms more than any other book of the Old Testament, but there's like 150 of them. And so it kind of feels like cheating because they're by a lot of different authors spread out over a long period of time. If you get rid of the book of Psalms, and it's even close in number there, then Jesus quotes Deuteronomy more than anything else. That ought to be enough to help us to say, okay, Deuteronomy mattered to Jesus. There's a lot there for him to say. In the New Testament, there's Psalm 68 quotes, 55 that come from Isaiah for good reason, and then 44 that come from Deuteronomy. And then there's kind of a big drop. And I showed all the way down to Exodus. After Exodus, you go from 31 quotes in that book to 13 in Leviticus. And so Deuteronomy is well represented in the New Testament. That's the big point. One of the things that I'm doing with each of these books is I'm saying, what are some of the basic introduction things? How's the book structured? What's the book's message? And what's the connection to Jesus in the New Testament? The chart behind me, I haven't shown you any of the direct connections, but you ought to be able to see from this chart behind me that there are a lot of them whenever you go into the New Testament, and way too many for us to even overview, even the biggest chunk of them. One of the things that I think of the most, just by way of thinking of this before we get started, is when Jesus was being tempted in the wilderness in Matthew chapter 4, and the devil came to him and said, if you are the Son of God, it was to Deuteronomy that Jesus turned. And it was Deuteronomy that he thought of and quoted. And so lots of good stuff in here. The Hebrew title comes from Deuteronomy 1 and verse 1, just like the first 5 books of the Old Testament. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan. The Hebrew title is These Are the Words. That's how the book starts, and so that's what the book is called. Deuteronomy is a word that means second law. Deutero, what's a duo? A duo is 2. And so you see the 2, the second part of that. Nomos is the Greek word for law. And so Deutero, nomos, second law. That's what the book Deuteronomy means. And it comes from Deuteronomy 17 and verse 18, where God is explaining to Israel, whenever you appoint for yourself a king, these are some of the things that he is not to do, and this is one of the things that he is supposed to do. He is supposed to, in chapter 17 and verse 18, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of the law approved by the Levitical priest. We've referred to the Septuagint a lot, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, and this is actually a mistake. It should be that he is to write for himself in a book a copy of this law, But the Septuagint, in translating the Hebrew, used the word Deuteronomy, a version of the word Deuteronomy, to say he is to make a second law. Which the intent is probably copy, but they probably should have just used the word copy. Well, this is an interesting little thing to know about this, that the word Deuteronomy in the book of Deuteronomy comes from a translation mistake. It's just one of those things that might come up in Trivial Pursuit one day, and you can score a point that way. But that's what Deuteronomy is. The idea of second law is not wrong or bad. We talked about this last time. If you want to turn in your Bible to Numbers chapter 20. In Numbers chapter 20, starting in verse 22, this is the third stage of Israel's wandering in the wilderness. They go from Egypt to Mount Sinai, that's stage 1. Then they go from Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, that's stage 2. And then from Kadesh Barnea, they go from here. Remember, they can't go through Edom. They go down around Edom, and they camp here in the plains of Moab on this side of the Jordan River. That's Numbers chapter 20 and verse 22. It says, they journeyed from Kadesh, and the people of Israel and the whole congregation came to Mount Hor. And this is when they traveled around Mount Hor. Deuteronomy 21 is about how they fight against these people and they take this land. But chapter 21 and verse 35, so they defeated him and his sons and all his people until he had no survivor left, and they possessed his land. That's where it becomes official that Israel is in this land that now belongs to them, and it's called the plains of Moab. If you will turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 1, you will see why we've been talking about this. We're getting ready at this point on the plains of Moab. We're getting ready to cross over the Jordan River, and you know that the first thing that Joshua is going to do is take the city of Jericho. So here is Israel on the plains of Moab, getting ready to go into the inheritance that God has promised to his people. And on these plains, as they're getting ready to go in and take the land, that's what the book of Deuteronomy is. Look at chapter 1 and verse 1. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan in the wilderness. That's on the east side of the Jordan River. In the Arabah, opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel. In verse 2, it is 11 days' journey from Horeb, that's Mount Sinai, by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. That's stage 2 of the wandering. In the 40th year, that's worth underlining in your Bible. It's our time stamp for the book. In the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses spoke to the people of Israel, according to all that the Lord had given him in commandment to them. After he had defeated Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon, and Og, the king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth and the Edrei, beyond the Jordan in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to explain this law, saying, and then he says the book of Deuteronomy. Turn over to chapter 5. There's a couple of really important things about this that I think tell us what this book is and why this book matters even for us. In chapter 5 and verse 1, it says, Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and the rules that I speak in your hearing today, and you shall learn them and be careful to do them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb, at Mount Sinai. Not with our fathers did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us here alive today. Moses is saying, our parents met God at Mount Sinai when they got the 10 Commandments. And we've been wandering around the wilderness for 40 years. And here we are getting ready to go into the promised land. And what Moses says is, that covenant, that God made back on Mount Sinai, it wasn't just with our parents who died the last couple of years in the wilderness that he made that covenant. He made it with us. And so Deuteronomy is Moses telling the people, this is what God said to us, not to our parents, to us. This is for our generation. It's a renewal of the covenant. In fact, whenever we get done with this and I give a one-sentence summary of the book of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy is a renewal of the covenant that God made with Israel at Sinai. Look at chapter 29 and verse 1. While you're turning over to 29 and verse 1, you can start to think about some of the practical stuff to think about. I mean, maybe there is not a verse in Deuteronomy that says this, but its very existence teaches us that even for Israel, who was born into the family of God, there is a renewal generation by generation, person by person, who enters into this covenant agreement with God. Nobody is right with God because their parents were right with God. Every generation has to do that for themselves. And that's what Deuteronomy is. It's to say to the next generation, we've gone over most of this stuff before, but now it's for you. You need to do this. Deuteronomy 29 and verse 1, these are the words of the covenant that the Lord commanded Moses to make with the people of Israel in the land of Moab, besides the covenant that he had made with them at Horeb. This is the new covenant, the old covenant with this new group of people. Okay, that's part one. Just some introduction information about Deuteronomy. Part two is going to be maybe put you to sleep boring for some of you, and maybe the greatest thing you've ever heard for some of you. I think Erica is going to be our resident expert on this subject. I don't. Was it your capstone paper? Is this a major project, the treaties that you wrote? Yeah. Erica knows probably more about this than I do. So if you got any questions, go to her to talk about it. This is the ancient world. Here is Egypt, where the Israelites were coming from. They come up into the land of Canaan. I'm showing you this map because up here is the kingdom, the empire of the Hittites. It's called the Hurrian Empire. And the Hittites, moving into the time when Moses led Israel into the promised land, the Hittites were even more dominant and more powerful than the Egyptians in this time, which is a really big deal. And one of the things that the Hittites did as they expanded and conquered all of the people around them is they would offer a treaty. And here's just something about the treaty that they would offer. There's two kinds. The great Hittite kings were accustomed to negotiating two types of international treaties, one of which was an agreement with an equal, the so-called parity treaty. The other was a kind entered into with an inferior, the suzerain or the vassal treaty. The latter, the vassal treaty, the latter variety has survived in abundance and was of obvious importance in maintaining the stability of the Hittite Empire. Vassal treaties were formulated according to a well-established pattern. And so it's basically like Jay is a Hittite foreign ambassador, and he knows how to write Hittite treaties for the people that we conquer. There's a pattern that you do. And this is why we're talking about this right now. The form of the suzerain treaty was evidently well known throughout the ancient Near East in the late Bronze Age. Moses gave the law of Moses in 1446. We're in the neighborhood. And when the structure of Deuteronomy is analyzed, it will be seen to correspond strikingly to the secular covenantal form as follows. Deuteronomy is basically structured as one of these Hittite vassal treaties. And so what I'll do, I'm just going to throw the whole thing up here for you. Normally what I would do is I would do point by point by point by point, And then after we went through the points, I would go back through Deuteronomy. For the sake of time, we're just going to do it all in one fell swoop. But these treaties all begin with an introduction where the treaty says, this is a written copy of what was agreed upon by both parties. They start with the common words. These are the words that were spoken. And so when you look at Deuteronomy 1 and verses 1 through 5, 1 through 4, it looks almost identical to one of these ancient Hittite vassal treaties. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan in the wilderness. And he explains a little bit about who's involved. There's Moses, there's God, there's Israel. It's an introduction to set up the story. The next thing that happens in these treaties is a history section. It's called a historical prologue. And the history section is, maybe we, the Hittites, have been at war with you, the Jewish nation, for however long. And so we're going to talk about the history. We're going to talk about that war. Maybe we've been at peace for a little bit of time. And so we're going to talk about that peace, but we're going to talk about our relationship. And so if you just start in Deuteronomy 1 and verse 6, you can see that all the way through the end of chapter 4 is basically the history of Israel leaving Egypt, going to Mount Sinai, traveling around in the wilderness for 40 years. It's where they went and it's what they did. It's the historical prologue that tells about the history of this group of people. Oops, I'm going to have to put this down, or I'm going to click every time I go to another point. The next section is the laws, and this is the thing that I like the most about this, how Deuteronomy matches the treaty format. There's two sections of laws in the treaty format. There's general or basic, and that is where the Hittites will explain themselves as liberators. They're always liberators. They're not conquerors of people. They're liberators. We saved you. And sometimes we didn't save you from an enemy. We saved you from yourself, from your ignorance or from your uneducated ways of life or something like that. But the Hittites have saved this group of people, and they say, now we have this relationship with one another, but don't you even think about rebelling. And don't even think about entering into a covenant agreement or relationship with any other nations. Yes, we have liberated you, and this is described as a nice relationship, but you belong to us in general terms. And then it gets more specific after that. And the more specific is like, what do you do if your slave runs away? Or what do you do if your ox kills somebody else's ox? Or how much tribute are you going to have to pay and taxes are you going to have to pay to the Hittite Empire? Those things fall into the specific section. If you will look through Deuteronomy 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, you're going to see this outline. You're going to see a very general, big, basic overview of what it means to be God's people. And so in Deuteronomy 5, it just starts with the 10 Commandments. It doesn't get any more general and basic than that. In chapter 6, we'll come back to this, but chapter 6 starts out in verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. This is big, 10,000-foot imagery of what Israel and God's relationship is going to be like under this covenant treaty agreement. I'll just say one thing about this real quick. If you only read one small piece of Deuteronomy, I hope you read the whole book. Deuteronomy is easily one of my favorite books of the Bible. But if you only read one small piece, Deuteronomy 5 through 11, because of what it is some of the most moving and applicable stuff for us and what it means to be God's people. It's some of the most descriptive of what it means to be God's people in all of the Bible. And so I would really encourage you, even if you don't read all of Deuteronomy, just read Deuteronomy 5 through 11 and ask the question, what is God saying for me about how it means to be one of his people? And then as you move through chapter 12 through 26, you're going to see specific stuff like this is how you serve in the tabernacle. This is what you are supposed to do with people who are idolaters and false prophets. And this is what animals are clean and unclean, specific laws and things like that. Then there are blessings and curses. We'll do this section and the next section together because the blessings and the curses go together. You know what? I should probably do the witness section first. Let's talk about the witness section first. Turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 31. These treaties are not just given between the Hittites and the people that the Hittites conquer. The treaty is between the gods of the Hittites and the gods of the people who have been conquered. And so often whenever there are witnesses called, it will be the gods of the Hittites and the gods of the people who are conquered. And so because the gods are called as witnesses, and because these treaties are between these gods, going back to the blessings and curses, the blessings and curses are, if you obey this treaty, you're going to be peaceful and prosperous, and the gods are going to bless you, and everything's going to be great, and you're going to be blessed, and it's going to be good. If you disobey the terms of this treaty agreement, then the gods in heaven will curse you and destroy you and wipe you off the face of the earth. And so I said look at 31. We'll look at the blessings and the curses. Deuteronomy 28 and verse 1. If you faithfully obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments that I command you today, the Lord God is going to bless you. And here's a list of what he's going to do for you. In verse 15, but if you will not obey the voice of the Lord your God, or be careful to do all his commandments and his statutes that I command you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. And then he's going to list the curses, and the ultimate curse is, if you refuse to pay attention, you'll ultimately be destroyed. The witnesses listed in Deuteronomy 30 and 31 and 32 are heaven and earth. Heaven and earth aren't going anywhere, so God calls them as witnesses. The book of God's law is called as a witness. It's not going anywhere. I think that's what Jesus is referring to in Matthew 5 when he says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. The law will never pass away. I think it's this that he's referring to when he says that. God is called as a witness because he is eternal and he's not going anywhere. The storage section might seem boring to you. This is actually my favorite. Look at Deuteronomy 31. There were always provisions for where the treaty would be stored. And so if you are the conquered vassal nation, then you are required, according to the terms of this treaty, to put the treaty in either your palace, a place of honor, or in your chief god's temple. You don't just stick the treaty with the Hittites on the shelf. And it's a part of the treaty that it will be held in honor and that it will be respected. And so if you're the conquered country, this is what you do with the treaty. The Hittites, often what they did is they took, for spurts, periods of time, they took some of the most prominent treaties of the people that they conquered, and the king would put them in a box, and he would use that box as his footstool. And it's a symbol that I am over and I have conquered all of these people. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 31 and verses 24 through 26. When Moses had finished writing the words of this law in the book to the very end, Moses commanded the Levites who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, take this book of the law and put it by the side of the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there for a witness against you. So a couple things here. I think there's a profound point to be made that there are two tablets of stone Normally what I think of when I think of the Ten Commandments is 1 through 5 and 6 through 10. If they're made in this treaty format, though, then it's probably 1 through 10, here's your copy. 1 through 10, here's my copy. And what is God saying when he says, take both of those copies and put them in the tabernacle in your midst? Yes, the Ark of the Covenant is the footstool of God, and he is over this group of people. But he doesn't take one copy back to heaven where he lives and leave one copy with the people in the temple where they live. Both copies are there in this same place to say to the Jewish people, I am in your midst. I live with you, among you. There is a huge ton of symbolism in this that we probably shouldn't miss. There are always provisions for the reading of the treaty. You don't just write a treaty with a group of people and stick it on the internet in the ancient world. You have to disseminate it somehow. And so normally it's annual readings. In Deuteronomy 31, starting in verse 9, you can read about the provisions to read this law. Moses wrote this law and gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. And Moses commanded them, at the end of every 7 years, at the set time of the year of release, at the Feast of Booths, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Assemble the people, men, women, little ones, sojourners with you in your towns, that they may hear and learn. And so we're going to make sure that we don't just have the word, this treaty agreement with God, and put it in the ark and leave it there as a memorial. We're going to share it with people for everybody to know for all time. And then also a part of the treaty is always a succession law, because whoever the current Hittite king is who makes this treaty, he's going to die. And when he dies, that's the time for uprising. And so as a part of the treaties always say, whenever I, the current Hittite king, dies, whoever is my successor, he will also be your king and he'll be over you. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 31 and verse 23, Joshua is formally appointed Moses' successor. And so here is something that fits this treaty format. God has not just said to Israel on the plains of Moab, hey, I made this agreement with your parents at Mount Sinai, and I would like for us to have this agreement also moving forward as we cross the Jordan River. He's renewing the covenant, but he's giving the covenant to this group of people in such a way so as to say two things. Look at Deuteronomy 7. The first thing that God says, as truly, this is not sarcastic or being funny to say this, God truly is a liberator of his people. To enter into a covenant agreement with them, it is a great blessing and honor for Israel to be a part of this. In chapter 7, in verses 7 through 9, it was not because you were more in number than any of the other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you, for you were the fewest of all the peoples, but it was because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore with your fathers, that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. You see the same thing in chapter 9 and verses 5 and 6. Not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart are you going in to possess the land, but because of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God is driving them out before you, and that he may confirm the word that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God gives Israel this covenant as a blessing. You are my people, and I am your God. And what a great blessing that is to have that relationship with God. But turn over to chapter 30 and verses 11 through 20. Make no mistake about it. Deuteronomy and the covenant with God is, you are blessed to be in this relationship. And this is going to be good for everybody. This is going to be good. God gets his people that he loves, and his people gets a God who is the creator of heaven and earth with an awesome law to rule their people and to live by. Everybody wins with this. But at the same time, God finishes up by saying, this is not a parity treaty, an agreement between equals. This is a vassal treaty where I am God and you are my people, and if you don't keep the terms of this agreement, you're going to be destroyed. It's that simple. In verse 11, for this commandment that I command you today is not too hard for you, neither is it far off. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will ascend into heaven for us and bring it down to us, that we may hear it and do it. That's quoted in Ephesians. It was Jesus who went into heaven and brought it down to us. In verse 13, neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will go over the sea for us and bring it to us that we may hear it and do it. But the word is very near you. It's right over there in the tabernacle, in the Ark of the Covenant. The word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart so that you can do it. See, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I command you today, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways, by keeping his commandments and his statutes and his rules, then you shall live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you're entering to take possession of it. But if your heart turns away, and you will not hear, but are drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you will surely perish. You will surely not live long in the land that you're going over the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore, choose life, that you and your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice, and holding fast to him. For he is your life and length of days, that you may dwell in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give to them. It's a great blessing to have this covenant agreement with God. But don't mistake blessing with, oh, that's nice, I think I'll choose not to do it. God is our superior, and we are his vassals, his servants. And we will either serve him and be blessed by that, or choose to disobey him and ultimately be destroyed because of it. That's what the book of Deuteronomy is for Israel. The generation before them, their parents, they chose to complain and grumble and disobey God, and every one of them died in the wilderness. Every single one of them died in the wilderness. Moses says on the plains of Moab, hey guys, we're getting ready to go into the promised land. Let's not do this again. Let's obey God this time. Let's serve him and inherit all of his blessings. Let's go to Deuteronomy 6. I read this morning, and so maybe I'll just go ahead and point you to it today. We won't read the whole thing today. If you're going to summarize the book of Deuteronomy in one sentence or a couple of sentences, I am just super tempted to use this text. This is the theme not only of Deuteronomy but of the whole Bible, starting in verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. These words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and all of this. God says eventually in verse 12, Take care lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. It is the Lord your God you shall fear. Him you shall serve, and by his name you shall swear. You shall not go after other gods, the gods of the people who are around you. For the Lord your God in your midst is a jealous God, lest the anger of the Lord your God be kindled against you, and he destroy you from off the face of the earth. That's as good a summary of Deuteronomy as I can find. Look at Deuteronomy 17. If there's one thing that I can say about, I think I can put this up here real quick. That's Deuteronomy 6. Yahweh is God, there is no other. If we love him and serve him entirely, we'll be blessed. If not, we'll be destroyed. If there's one thing I can say about Deuteronomy, and the last thing is always to point us to Jesus. It's in Deuteronomy 17. This is the only place in the law of Moses where a king is regulated. Where there's any kind of law talking about the king, what the king is supposed to do and not do, and what the king is supposed to be like. I think it's especially neat that this book is called Deuteronomy and it comes from this section. That might be how you remember what's going on here. Start with me in verse 14. The king over God's people is not like any other king in any other nation. At least he's not supposed to be. Starting in verse 14. When you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set a king over you whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. He can't be a foreigner. He has to be like you. And it's these sorts of things that make it a really big deal why we talk about Jesus, who was born from a woman, who is a man, who came down from heaven to be with us and like us. He is to be one of your brothers. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. The king of God's people is somebody who says, we have been freed from that kind of slavery, and we're never going back. Let's go this way. Not for security, horses and military power, not for our own personal might. We are never going that way again. That's what the king of God's people is supposed to be like. In verse 17, he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. This is basically a description of every king and every kingdom for all history. It's all about me and how I can get more stuff for myself. But God says, when you have a king over you, he's not going to be like that. He's going to be somebody who leads you to the Lord. And the way that he's going to lead you to the Lord is he himself is going to be devoted to the Lord. Look at verse 18. When he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy, Deuteronomy, the second law, a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priest. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of the law and these statutes and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, that he may not turn aside from the commandment, either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in this land, he and his children in Israel. Besides the Shema in Deuteronomy chapter 6, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. This is, I think, one of the most impressive things about Deuteronomy, because it points us to Jesus and what kind of king he was, and why it's so awesome that he is the king that he is. He's not high and elevated, sitting in royalty and gold and jewels. He's stooping down to wash people's feet. He's like his brother. And he's leading people to God, the most important thing that a king can do. Not to military victory, not to personal renown and glory, but bringing souls to God. If you don't see Jesus in what kind of king Israel was supposed to have, then I think you're probably not reading it correctly. I think it's also worthwhile to look at 1 Kings chapter 10. We're not going to do that now. 1 Kings chapter 10, starting in verse 14. Solomon was the greatest king Israel ever had. And he pretty much violated every single one of these things. Earthly leaders have not got it done, but Jesus did. So here's our summary. I'm not going to read every single summary every single time, but this is the end of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses. Genesis explains to wandering Israel who they are, where they came from, how they got there, where they're going, and why they're going there. Exodus tells how God drew Israel through the water from serving Pharaoh and building his kingdom to being a holy and priestly nation, building up Yahweh's house and his kingdom. Leviticus teaches us how to be that holy and priestly nation. Numbers tells how the Exodus generation failed to be a holy and priestly nation in the wilderness, so they did not enter God's rest. All the earth will be filled with God's glory, so the next generation will get a try. Deuteronomy renews God's covenant with that next generation as they prepare to take their shot. That's the first 5 books of the Bible. If you're here tonight and you're not a Christian, the 2 main takeaways, the 2 main points that we talked about from Deuteronomy apply to your Christianity as much as anything else. Number 1, Jesus is king. He's a perfect king. He's an awesome king. And the question is, will you bow your knee to him and serve him? The Shema is that the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and there are no other gods. If you're willing to make that commitment, to come to the Lord and to say, I'm ready to put you before everything else, we would love to help you with that. Come forward, make your needs known as together we stand and sing the invitation song.